Hello, our first lecture for class is going to be a brief one. I'm just going to very briefly talk about what is sustainability in the first place. And we are going to kind of rehash this definition and criticisms of sustainability for the entire course. But this is just going to be, again, a short introduction to that. So sustainability is broadly defined where the needs of each member of the biosphere are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So everybody right now on Earth is getting what they need, and all future generations will have enough to get what they need. We are not really doing this right now. People talk about sustainability on multiple scales, so we can talk about globally, as this definition is, but we can also talk about sustainable, production of shrimp, which shrimp is really grown now in most places and not necessarily wild caught, right? So are you not damaging the environment so much so that you will have enough shrimp for future generations? The criticisms of a lot of definitions of sustainability is that they're very vague. If you go to Rubio's and you get a shrimp taco and it says that that shrimp is sustainably produced, what does that mean? Are they just talking about environmental sustainability? Because as we're going to talk about, sustainability is not just about the environment. So very often we use this word without thinking a lot about it. A lot of people have trouble defining sustainable without using the term sustainable, which doesn't really work. And then it's also where this label often gets thrown onto practices or products where it may not actually be creating a difference, but it looks good, right? We all want to buy something that is sustainable. We all want to do something that is sustainable. And so this is an article from last year that says, does sustainability help the environment or just agriculture's public image, right? Is what these farmers are doing or being asked to do in terms of being sustainable actually making a difference? Or do they just get to slap a label on that says, we're sustainable? And so sustainability is all about the triple bottom line. So you can think about there's three components, and I'll talk about each of those individually. But there's the environment, which we want to take care of. There's the economy or economics. Right, we want to be sustainable, but we also need to earn money and have a healthy economy, at least in this perspective. And social, people, right? We also want things to be sustainable for people. So I believe this is the way your book does it: environmental, economic, social. It may not be actually. This may be from a previous book that I used, but a lot of people use the three E's, which is environment, economy, and equity. The most common one is probably the three P's: profit, planet, and people. And we are going to next week, I believe, in the next module, you're going to have to come up with kind of a new conceptual model of sustainability. This is just one of them. This is the most common one. I'll show you some different examples of ones next time. But this idea that you have to be taking care of all three of these, be paying attention to all three of these. The environment component is usually the one that people think about first with sustainability. It's the one that, for me, usually students have the easiest time grasping and thinking of, right? How do we take care of the environment? And we often use the term environment to mean the natural world in places like this, but it also means places like this, right? Urban settings. And we're going to talk about urban sustainability later in the semester, but basically, part of the reason that we need the environment, other than the fact that it just is nice and we get to hang out there, is that it provides something for us called ecosystem services. So an ecosystem is just, kind of a system where you have energy inputs and outputs and things are happening. You can have ecosystems at multiple scales. You could have the ecosystem of my backyard. You could talk about the ecosystem of Southern California. You could talk about the ecosystem of the entire planet Earth. But the idea of ecosystem services is just that ecological systems provide us with things that we need. And a lot of people do not think of the planet this way. But basically, this is a giant system, and it does a bunch of things that we need, in order for us to live here. A big one being it purifies our air and water, right? And I'll show an example of that in a minute, but it cycles our nutrients, right? So things decompose, become fertilizer, new things grow. It regulates the climate, which this is part of the issue right now that we've messed with it, and now the climate is changing. I don't do a particular unit on climate change in this class, but climate change will come up repeatedly. It pollinates plants. This is huge. Um, Years ago, there was that film, Bee Movie, where all the little bees went on strike and then a bunch of plants died. That would actually happen if bees could go on strike. But if the bees were gone, it would be very bad. And so a lot of bees are disappearing, and a lot of people are worried about this. California is, I believe, the #1 producer of almonds, and all of those almonds are pollinated by bees. So we need bees and some other life to pollinate plants, but mostly bees. And it also receives and recycles our waste, um, right? So again, in terms of that, like cycling nutrients, but also we're going to talk a lot about our waste, the waste we produce. We have a lot of consumption right now, and as a consequence, we produce a lot of waste. Most of us don't really think about it. We throw it in the garbage can, then we throw it in another garbage can, we throw it out at the curb, and lo and behold, a magic truck comes by and takes it away, and we never have to think about it again. Um, but our planet needs to deal with all of this waste that we're producing. So, for example, the hydrologic cycle, right? It rains, some water comes down in a stream, we capture some of it, we drink it, we use it for our homes and our businesses and to grow food. Some of it's going to evaporate off, some of it we're going to let back out into waterways. It's going to go out into the ocean, it's going to evaporate off, it's going to go through the clouds, it's going to rain again. All the water that is on the planet is all the water that has ever been on the planet. We just keep recycling the same stuff over and over again. We're not making any new water. And our uses have impacts. Um, some of which we notice immediately, some of which happen slowly and we notice less immediately. But this is the end of the Colorado River, which reached the ocean recently for a brief period of time, but it doesn't reach the ocean anymore. We pull enough water out of the Colorado River that it never makes it there. So this is what the end of that river, which used to be a river delta, looks like. And when we increase in population, and we'll talk more about this moving forward as well, the more people who are on the planet, right, we're intensifying these impacts. Not that long ago, we had under 1 billion people on the planet, and now we're up to 7 billion, right? This is incredibly fast population growth. Some people think we're going to kind of cap out at about 9 billion, but that remains to be seen. Going from 1 billion to 7 billion is pretty darn extreme. And then, we consume a lot of resources. A lot of people think of things like fossil fuels and trees, but we also do things like fish. I study a lot of sustainable fisheries, and so we have a growth in resource consumption that's also a problem. As more people eat fish, as more people want to eat fish, and as there are more people, right, the planet can't support that, and so we have a lot of fish stocks just completely collapsing. What you're going to do for your first exercise has to do with ecological footprint. And I work for a place called the Global Footprint Network as a research scientist looking at ecological footprint. But the idea behind ecological footprint is how much resources are we using in comparison to how many resources we have. So this is by country, ecological debtors and creditors. The Global Footprint Network has a much newer, better map. This is kind of an old one. This is a cartogram where consumption is, your country gets bigger with the more you consume. So if you look at the United States, right, we have a lot of resources in the United States, but we consume an awful lot. So does a lot of places in Europe. But if everyone consumed the amount of resources that the U.S. does, we would need 4.5 Earths. A lot of places like in sub-Saharan Africa, are not consuming a lot of resources. Some countries in here are red just because they don't have a lot of resources. So it's not that they consume as much per capita as the United States, but their countries, such as in Northern Africa and the Middle East, might not have a lot of resources um, due to that desert climate in the first place. But we are using resources 50% faster than they are being replenished. So the place that I work for, we have something called Earth Overshoot Day, which just happened on August 1st. So basically, the idea is on August 1st, by August 1st, we had used all of the resources that the planet is capable of uh, reproducing in a year. And so now, for the rest of the year, basically, we're operating on credit, and we are taking that away from future generations. And so um, there's this idea of carrying capacity, and that is the number of people or other living organisms or crops a region, ecosystem, or planet can support without environmental degradation. We are operating over carrying capacity. We are overshooting that. We have a higher ecological footprint than is going to be sustainable in the long term. It is like a bank account. If we deplete resources, we draw down the account, right? We have a certain amount of savings, but we are not living off the interest. We are depleting down that savings account. Natural capital is the accumulated wealth of the Earth's resources, right? So we are depleting that natural capital and we are withdrawing that natural capital 50% faster than it's being produced. So we have to live off nature's interest, if you think about it like a bank account, in order for us to be sustainable. So this is, you're going to take a footprint calculator that we have online, and you're going to write a little bit about that for your first exercise. But that's kind of a brief overview of the environmental aspect. There's also social. This is kind of usually a harder one for people to think about. Maybe a little bit more lately, it's been in the news. This is a graphic from several years ago. The 85 richest people own the same wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest people. So inequality is something that is in the news a lot lately. We have this growing gap between the rich and the poor. We have a concentration of wealth with a few people on the planet. And so what type of problems does that bring? Generally speaking, with an economy, if you want to have a healthy economy, you need to have a healthy middle class. But we think about social sustainability, people must have the resources they need in order to not just survive, but thrive. And that is an important one, right? We don't want to have people have just enough to get by. There are all types of things that come along with having enough resources, again, to thrive, right? When you're not constantly worrying about things like, where is my next meal coming from? Do I have enough food? Do I have enough water? Do I have a healthy environment? We're going to talk about environmental justice later in the semester, where you have individuals, low-income individuals, usually communities of color, who are facing harsher environmental effects of pollution than their wealthier, whiter counterparts. Do you have access to medical care and education and gender equality as well? And so when we look at, this is a hunger map from the World Food Program from 2013, right? We think about, where in the world are we experiencing hunger, right? So why is there so much inequality there? But even within the United States, 1 in 6 people in America is food insecure, which we'll talk about food insecurity when we talk about our food systems, right? But that hunger exists here as well. It just looks a little bit different, right? We can think about water scarcity. Some of this water scarcity is due to the climate. Some of it is due to people not being able to afford water, right? In the United States, this map would change a little bit, but right, we have a dry climate here. So we are approaching physical water scarcity. Excuse me, as I'm going to lose my voice while I'm recording this. Some places it's economic water scarcity. Maybe there's water, but you can't afford it, right? We have pretty darn cheap water in the United States, and we take it for granted that every time we walk over to the tap, maybe if you live in Flint, Michigan, but you walk over to the tap, you turn it on, clean drinking water comes out. That is not the case in much of the world. Or things like, this again, pollution in a healthy environment. This is air pollution in China. Uh, Health inequalities: 21,000 children every day die before their fifth birthday. They die of things like pneumonia and malaria and diarrhea and other preventable diseases. Why is that? Why we just had, I forget the name of it, but basically a day where we kind of, Women's Equality Day, I believe it was, or Equal Pay Day, I forget. But generally speaking, there's a lot of gender inequality, right? 60% of those living in extreme poverty are women, despite the fact that we make up half of the world's population. Um, we are more likely to be illiterate. We only earn 1/10 of the world's income. Um, and so we can often hear, like, well, a woman makes 70 cents for every dollar that a man makes in the United States. This it differs depending on which country you're in. These numbers are much lower if you are a woman of color. It's closer to 60%. And the last thing is economic sustainability. And this is often used as an excuse not to do things that are sustainable in the other ways. Basically, if we promote these sustainable things, we're going to hurt the economy. You're going to watch a TED Talk after this um, uh, by a man from IKEA talking about how do we make money while being sustainable. And we often confuse this with consumption, meaning that in order to be sustainable, we have to buy something different. Somebody bought me this book several years ago called The Whole Green Catalog, 1,000 best things you can do for you and the earth. And a lot of it was to buy something new. Um, and really, in the reduce, reuse, recycle paradigm, the best thing that you can do is reuse. So, one of the things that we'll talk about is how do we have sustained capitalism? Is that even possible? Some people would argue it is not possible. But when we have this entire economy that's built upon everybody to keep consuming things, how do we make that sustainable? So, again, that's the end of your first lecture. And you're going to watch a TED Talk next, and then you're going to complete your first exercise.